Hey, we should be live here.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the last session for today. Hope you've been enjoying the earlier sessions. If you haven't had a chance to join us for the lived experience ones, please do check them out. They will be on YouTube. Lots of really great, challenging, but also really admirable stories that you can check out on our YouTube channel. So I'm Marta Urbanik. I'm an assistant professor for the CCR, and I have the great honor of chairing this panel right now entitled On the Outside, Challenges to Reentry. We have three great panelists. We have David Pyrooz, we have Katharina Maier, and we have Jamie Fader. If you are watching us from YouTube right now, please feel free to use the chat function to ask any questions to our presenters, and then we'll deal with all the questions at the end of the session. So without further ado, Jamie, could you please start us off?
I'm happy to. Thank you all for joining us. I wanted to start with an admission that my paper is not actually about the challenges of reentry, as the session title suggests, but it's rather about the challenges of living in a Philadelphia neighborhood that's known as a reentry community. I've also decided to go old school and skip the slides in the hopes that my talk would be as good as David Garland's keynote yesterday. Haha. My name is Jamie Fader, and I teach and do research at Temple University's Criminal Justice Department. And I've spent the last 6 years engaged in research in a community in Philadelphia called Frankford. In today's talk, I'm going to talk about my interviews with men living in that community. And I'm going to focus on their perceptions of risk, which they call drama. So I'm going to start by describing the various sources of drama that they experience in their lives and work very hard to avoid. All of this drama is rooted in the unpredictable nature of the criminal legal system and the decoupled relationship between behavior and sanctions. I'm then going to detail their use of what I call network avoidance, which is their reluctance to form and build social ties as they work to avoid drama. I conclude by considering the potential negative effects of network avoidance on their opportunities for advancement and their community as a whole. I'm going to say only a very few words about my research design, and I'm very happy to answer additional questions during the Q&A. The community on which this study's conducted is called Frankford, which is in the lower northeast section of Philadelphia. It's a pretty large neighborhood with 69,000 people, racially diverse, about a third Black and a third white, and a little more than a third Latino. And it's an impoverished community with high rates of crime and violence. So it's firmly nested in the 15th Police District, which is by far the busiest district in Philadelphia, as measured by police calls for service. It also contributes to and absorbs a disproportionate number of individuals who are returning from jails and prisons. So among a cohort of 2015 releasees, Frankford is ranked second in the city with almost 1,600 returning citizens from jails, and represents the highest prison expenditures in the city at $58.5 million. So this study was carried out between 2014 and 2019, and I began with a purposive sampling design that was supposed to allow me to conduct comparisons between racial ethnic groups. I ended up with 23 men who identified as Black, 5 as Latino, and 17 as white, although many of these men occupied multiple categories. So that made things a little more challenging than I expected. I conducted, and my research team conducted interviews with 45 men who were approximately 25 to 34 years of age at the time of the study. And most of these interviews lasted between 2 and 4 hours. They were quite extensive. We also conducted official criminal record checks, and all of the contextual information about the community was drawn from 5 years of participant observation at community events and meetings throughout the period of time that we were conducting interviews. So I'm going to start by talking about drama as a focal concern for these men. So the Frankfurt men, particularly those of color, described a preoccupation with trouble, which they called drama, that stemmed from the unpredictable nature of the criminal legal system, as well as the regular threat posed by street and police violence. Their perceived vulnerability to the system was underscored by David, who was a 26-year-old Black self-proclaimed preacher's kid, who reported that his 25th birthday felt like a milestone. And he told me, I was praying every day in my 20s, God, get me to 21. God, Lord, get me to 22, because I know out here, I mean, not just help me live, but make sure I'm not locked up, make sure I'm not caught on something stupid. So when I made it to 25 and I didn't have a criminal record and I wasn't shot at least a couple of times, I was like, dang, thank you. I celebrated so hard that night. I asked, did you feel like you were in the clear? And he laughed. No, it's like, now get me to 50, because I've seen it happen to the best of us, where no record, no past situations or anything, and still got locked up for something stupid. I have a little bit of a sigh of relief, but even still, I know I got to keep my hands clean. I've got to cross all my T's and dot my I's, because I could still be in the system tomorrow. David's insistence that he must be extremely careful to avoid being incarcerated or shot is especially profound because he possesses many characteristics that should reduce this uncertainty of risk. He has no criminal record. He hasn't engaged in illegal activities. He's chosen friends who are not involved in crime and don't even use drugs recreationally. He lives in the safest section of Frankfurt. He's the son of a well-known pastor, and he's friendly with the police officers who live on his block. But we might imagine someone like him wouldn't spend much time thinking about risk. But he reported to us that he does worry about it a lot, particularly when compared to his white friends. Drama is a situation of trouble or conflict with the authorities or persons that inevitably spills over from the initial participants to families, friends, and other relationships. It may bring them into contact with law enforcement, even if it doesn't begin there. The term drama evokes an expenditure of emotionality or a roller coaster of ups and downs that creates chronic stress. But it also suggests a loud or demonstrative performance that draws the unwanted attention of others. Men who use the term drama to describe unpredictable forms of trouble they navigate on a regular basis view it as an immature and risky way of relating to the world. When men say they don't have time for drama, they mean they're trying to be productive citizens, to have predictable daily existences, engaged in pro-social activities like work, monogamy, and caring for family. In our interviews, men described various types of drama. Every single respondent reported seeing police on a daily basis, and many said they interacted with them frequently. These men described being routinely stopped, questioned, and frisked, whether they were on foot or driving in cars. Many recounted incidents of brutality at the hands of the police, including being slammed, power drilled, or broadsided. The unpredictable nature of interactions with agents of the criminal legal system was underscored by Nasir, a 30-year-old Black Muslim. He says, I was wrongfully arrested. I was in the tap room minding my business. I don't drink nor smoke. I was playing pool, but there was something going on. You know, this area, there's always something. Someone got shot, murdered, robbed, or whatever. They come, you know, and raid the bar. People's throwing things. There's a gun on the floor. They come and beat the crap out of me, put the gun on me, lied, and said, I seen him throw a gun. I proved that it was a lie, though, with cameras and stuff and witnesses. They came to trial and apologized. They didn't see me throw the gun. So to this day, I have a lawsuit against the city. I was in prison 4 years for that. Residents of inner city communities in Philly share stories of false charges and imprisonment, dirty cops, and huge cash settlements, which forms a body of folk knowledge of how the system operates. Nasir's claim to have been in prison for 4 years for a trumped-up charge was in fact consistent with his court record. And it also jibes with the city's data on malicious prosecution, false arrest, false imprisonment, and overturned conviction claims, which paid out almost $40 million in the last decade. At the deep end of the risks named by the men that we interviewed were incarceration and violent death. The negative predictions born out of the super predator panic were so fully internalized by men of color growing up during that area that defying them has become the yardstick by which many measure their own success. Youssef, a 28-year-old Black man who had previously been involved in drug sales, reflected, "I look at my life and pat myself on the back. There are not many 28-year-olds who are still alive and kicking. Most are either dead or in jail, so I applaud myself." The primary means of avoiding risky situations in Frankfurt involves what I call network avoidance, a deliberate restriction of social ties that are regarded as increasing the likelihood of uncertainty or drama. Network avoidance is grounded in young men's perception that their own risk of being caught up in neighborhood drama can't be fully mitigated by their adult status or even their law-abiding behavior. Men of color are especially aware of dangers they face because of systemic racism. Those who engage in network avoidance describe three strategies: staying in the house or leaving the neighborhood altogether for social activities, keeping a tight circle of trusted friends and family, and carefully managing or outright ending relationships with individuals who could trigger the criminal legal system. And I'll just describe each of these three very briefly. Approximately half of the men in Frankfurt reported staying in the house as a strategy for avoiding drama. They remained indoors for long stretches of their waking hours, reducing their exposure to people and situations that could result in trouble. Several said, "I don't really go outside," or "I don't really walk around anymore." Their homes are simultaneously shelters and prisons. Nasir, a 34-year-old Black father who'd been released from prison 15 months before our interview, explained that he reduced his risk of rearrest by sticking to a strict routine and avoiding going out at night. He says, "I drive. I go to the gym at certain times of day. I go in the house. I'm never on the streets. 10:30, 11 o'clock at night, I'm in the house by 10 or earlier than that sometimes. I don't hang out on corners. I rarely stand outside unless I'm in the park or I'm running." Several other studies have shown that residents of high violence communities don't go outside. The Frankfurt men, however, were just as likely to identify contact with the justice system as posing untenable risk to their lives and freedom. In their experience, the criminal legal system has apparently no logic nor legitimacy, and simply going about one's business is not enough to avoid being caught up in aggressive law enforcement. The second kind of network avoidance is managing troublesome places and people. The spatial and social aspects of safely navigating these landscapes can't easily be separated. Men create mental maps of dangerous ecological and social terrain, which includes corners, public transportation stops, and businesses where other men congregate. Safe navigation involves careful attention to one's presentation of self in these public staging areas. Grant, a 27-year-old Black respondent, told us that his risk of arrest depended on the surveillance level of a specific area. He says, if you're around a hot area, risk of being arrested would be like 75%. If you're not around it, then it's 0. You could talk to someone and then get put up on the wall by the cops, and the dude might have 4 bags of drugs on him, and the cops say, "Looks like y'all have 4 bags on you." Several of the men we interviewed discussed how they negotiated with other men in public as they moved about Frankfurt and other parts of the city. Wesley, a 26-year-old Black Latino military veteran, says he uses a standard greeting, "How you doing, brother?" as he passes the drug sellers on his way to the corner store. He explained to us that this is meant to signal, "I'm one of you, but I'm not into that." He elaborated, "I don't really know anyone around my home, and I don't really try to. Associating with the wrong people can get you into trouble." Finally, keeping a tight circle meant extending trust to only a handful of people who had demonstrated their trustworthiness over a long period of time. Men using this strategy were able to leverage some of the support functions of a social network without running the risk of drama. Trust and betrayal are prominent themes in their life stories, and nearly every respondent said that a good friend had betrayed them in the past. Romantic ties can also bring risk and uncertainty. Men's vulnerable position in relation to mass incarceration and supervision can be leveraged by intimates during the course of romantic conflict. For some men, this makes romantic relationships with women, especially those who are prone to drama, a risky proposition. Some men view women, particularly their children's mothers, as manipulating the system to their personal advantage. For example, Cam, who is 23, told us that he avoids seeing his daughter because he and her mother always argue when he goes over to their house to visit, and he's afraid she might call the police. As you might be able to tell from the examples that I've shared here, concerns about drama and the resultant use of network avoidance were much more common among the Black and Latino men in my study, and many identified their status as minoritized men as drawing unwanted and unwarranted attention from the police. 19 of the 23 men who worried about trouble and 16 of the 21 men who employed network avoidance were men of color. Lewis, a 30-year-old Black man, reported being pulled over in his car 3 to 4 times a year per year for the last decade. He responded in a way he hoped would be interpreted as non-threatening. He says, "I know my size. I keep my hands on the wheel, don't look at police in the face. I don't give him a reason to feel intimidated. He has a badge and gun. I have skin and bones." When comparing the daily activities of Frankfurt men by race, it's clear that white respondents were more likely to enjoy freedom to move about the neighborhood, and importantly, to leave the neighborhood. And they could do this to engage in work and socialization in other communities without having fear of the police or without concern that their social ties could lead to system contact. For example, Nick was a 33-year-old active opioid user, engaged in pretty high-profile behavior without a second thought. He earned income through junking and also self-reported destruction of property and multiple break-ins in the course of his scrapping activities. His peer group included other active drug users who got high together, including his former cellmate and others he described as not very upstanding citizens. They did this without any concern that it would result in scrutiny. So the harmful consequences of worrying about trouble or drama and of network avoidance are many. The vigilance needed to avoid trouble creates an environment of unrelenting stress. David, the preacher's kid at the beginning of this talk says, quote, "That's why Black people die so young. All the diabetes, high blood pressure, this, that, and a third, because we're stressed out more than the average person." David's observation is consistent with recent research on the adverse health effects of personal and vicarious police contact, which is the strongest for Black and Hispanic citizens. Network avoidance limits the development and maintenance of social ties, which are critical for healthy human development and serve as a safety net for the economically precarious. It prevents the accumulation of social capital, and it forces individuals to manage the risks they fear alone instead of part of a collective. As Sarah Brain points out, avoiding surveilling institutions such as banks and hospitals can result in increased financial or health insecurity. If this reluctance extends to avoiding social service agencies, men could lose opportunities for job training or other educational credentials that could help mitigate their disconnection from the labor market. Many of the Frankfurt men discussed distancing themselves from family members and romantic partners to mitigate their potential for drama, which has trickle-down effects on children and mothers. When practiced systematically, network avoidance likely has deleterious effects on communities as a whole. Young men of color are simply missing from the public sphere in Frankfurt, including typical masculine spaces like gyms or barbershops. Their lack of a visible presence and participation in the community and the dearth of their connections to others are likely to hinder the effects by neighbors to control crime through collective efficacy. Much of the discussion at civic association meetings was about the risks posed by and posed to young men of color, yet they were the most likely to be missing from these conversations that disproportionately affected them. Finally, network avoidance diminishes citizenship of those who practice it, reducing their ability to fully participate in society and extending the negative effects of mass incarceration. Mistrust of social institutions and avoidance of public spaces reduces community engagement, political participation, organizing, protesting, and capacity building, activities which build stronger social infrastructures and are engines of social and personal change. A critical analysis of network avoidance might lead us to ask if the goal was to effect the erasure and the annihilation of Black and brown men who have been constructed as dangerous in a manner that's consistent with contemporary colorblind ideology, what could be more effective than creating a social situation in which they confine and isolate themselves, seemingly by choice? Risk discourses originally applied to young men of color by labeling them super predators has been internalized by the very same men who were its targets, leading them to define themselves and their worlds in terms of risk. The result is that men of color avoid prison walls by recreating social and physical confinement in their own homes and community. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that fantastic talk, Jamie. Next, we have Katharina Maier. Whenever you're ready.
Thank you so much. I'll just share my screen here. Here we go. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much to members of the Center for Criminological Research and organizers of the conference for the opportunity to speak here today. And thank you to everyone who's listening to our panel. I hope you're well and safe during these unsettling times. I'm Zooming from Treaty 1 territory, also known as Winnipeg. And my talk today is titled Halfway Houses, Supervision and the Organizational Dimensions of Prisoner Reentry in Canada. So in this talk, I will provide insight into the organizational dimensions of prisoner reentry, focusing in particular on the role of halfway houses in the context of Canadian punishment. I will draw upon and extend my arguments offered in a recent Probation Journal paper where I discuss how NGO-employed halfway house workers define their role and practice their role as intermediary quasi-state workers at the intersection of punishment and welfare. Specifically, I will show how halfway house workers position themselves in relation to state-employed parole officers, drawing on their limited legal authority to affirm their rehabilitative position and rationalize supervision and control as non-punitive acts. So this is a small aspect of a completed larger project on prisoner reentry based on interviews with 47 former prisoners and 26 staff at halfway houses and reentry organizations. So 15 of these staff worked at halfway houses. Tangentially, my talk, or perhaps more accurately, some of these ideas guiding the talk are also informed by research with colleagues on the work of community-based organizations in Winnipeg's inner cities who work with inner city communities and marginalized populations during the time of COVID-19. And some of these organizations who we interviewed just this summer and fall work with people coming out of prison in Winnipeg's inner city. So to give an overview, I will provide an overview of some of the literature guiding this research, as well as an overview of halfway houses in Canada. And will then proceed with my findings where I will discuss how halfway house workers positioned themselves as support workers, supervisors, and also as intermediaries. And then in the conclusion, I will share a little bit about the interorganizational dynamics of prisoner reentry and some reflection on the role of NGOs in Canadian punishment. Okay, so prisoner reentry, which is typically defined as the event and process of leaving prison and returning to the community, bears important organizational dimensions, meaning prisoner reentry is significantly shaped by the work of a range of organizations and actors who act on former prisoners, especially during the early stages of reentry, that are defined by a range of challenges, from finding employment, to finding housing, to reconnecting with family and friends. So we know from work by Nicole Kaufman, Jonathan Mitch, Reuben Miller, among others, that these organizations impact on ex-prisoners' lives and shape how returning prisoners think about themselves and how they think about their future, their past, and their present. So today, the focus of existing research on these organizational realities of prisoner reentry has been on the work of community-based prisoner reentry organizations and programs, and specifically their approach to and conceptions of former prisoners. And so this particular focus is not surprising, given that the numbers of community-based reentry organizations in the US, where much of reentry research is situated, appears to have increased over the past 25 years, along with an increase in the parolee population. Now, one of the side effects of this today dominant focus of reentry organizations, I would argue, is that it gives the impression that the reentry organization is the primary site of ex-prisoner reintegration, when it is probably more accurate to think of reentry organizations as only one organizational force or component of a larger web of reentry involved organizations. So in addition to expanding the focus to other organizations in the context of reentry, it's also important to recognize that rather than operating in silos, reentry organizations and halfway houses, for example, are linked both to each other as well as to additional organizational and institutional structures of the penal and the welfare state. In other words, the interrelational dynamics between different actors and organizations are important too. And so my talk today examines yet another organizational force that shapes the lives of former prisoners, and that is the halfway house. And so specifically, I will talk about how halfway house workers position themselves vis-a-vis parole officers. So let me say just a few words about halfway houses in the Canadian context. So halfway houses are located at the intersection of punishment and welfare, and the state and the non-state, and the prison and the community. And so for me, this makes these houses interesting and important penal sites. So Canadian halfway houses date back to the late 1940s, early 1950s. So we have Ingalls House in Toronto, which opened in 1947 and served women returning or coming out of the Andrew Mercer Reformatory for Women. And then just a little later in 1945, also in Toronto, Beverly Lodge opened its doors for men returning from provincial jails. Now, halfway houses were initially defined broadly as a wide variety of residential services for many kinds of persons in need. These houses were conceived of as liminal sites designed for people considered, in the words of Victor Turner, to be betwixt and between certain places and positions. So between the prison and the community, and between the status of prisoner and free citizen. These early correctional halfway houses were also referred to as post-release centers. So they were very small scale organizations, mostly run by religious organizations, and they provided returning prisoners with food, basic shelter, and some very basic programming. And most of the people who resided at these houses self-selected to go there after leaving prison, which is quite different from the case that we have today, which I will talk about in a second. Now, along with the expansion of other forms of so-called community corrections in Canada in the 1960s and 1970s, non-state agencies were increasingly responsibilized, authorized, and also provided with funding by the Canadian state to provide residential services in the form of structured halfway house facilities to ex-prisoners on conditional release. And so today there are roughly 150 NGO-run halfway houses in Canada, officially referred to as community-based residential facilities. And these facilities are mandated still today with the hybrid task of supervision and providing basic welfare and support services specifically to federal ex-prisoners on conditional release, which in the Canadian context means day parole, full parole, or statutory release. While NGO run, I would categorize these halfway houses not as non-state, but quasi-state agents, given their state authorizations, their supervision responsibilities, and government funding. So returning to the literature, while halfway houses are frequently used as sites of recruitment for potential participants to learn more broadly about reentry or reintegration, as empirical objects in their own right, they have received much less attention. As I've argued in other work, these halfway houses are penal sites, and indeed I've argued they essentially present and function as open prisons and produce pains similar to that of open prisons in Scandinavia or other places, as Victor Chamas, for example, has written about. Specifically, halfway houses in Canada combine state rules with their own rule regime. So beyond a state-required report and daily curfew, halfway houses exercise considerable autonomy in terms of imposing additional rules. These additional rules are not state-mandated or government-mandated, but resident violations of such rules are still typically reported to a person's parole officer. And in the worst case, can be seen or lead to what is sometimes called deteriorating behavior. So additional rules at halfway houses may include things such as further curfews in addition to the state-mandated curfew, rules around clothing, etiquettes, chores, and others. Importantly, while halfway house workers are responsibilized by the government to support and supervise ex-prisoners, ultimately they are not invested with the authority to make decisions regarding halfway house residents' penal future and legal future. So in other words, while decisions are not in their hands, they supervise, but they don't have the power to actually decide what should happen in case of an infraction. This decision lies solely with the state. And so this is the issue that I want to focus on for the remainder of the presentation. Because the fear of reincarceration looms large in the lives of returning prisoners, especially during the early stages of release, it is essential to consider how the responsibility for ex-prisoners' penal future and other aspects of their reentry is divided among different reentry workers, including halfway house workers, parole officers, and others. So I'll start with a quote by one halfway house staff interviewee, Kathleen. And here we have Kathleen, and she's saying, "I came into this field wanting to be a support person because I think these guys don't get that. I think a lot of people have given up on them. So I like to operate as a support person. And I think that's what makes the difference, as opposed to having just someone controlling and supervising you all the time." So interviews explained that they were initially drawn to work at a halfway house because they wanted to help and support individuals who they recognized faced various socioeconomic challenges and also societal stigma. So in the words of Oral and Wabi, they thought of themselves as, quote, people who valued their perceived ability to support residents through what they thought was a trusting, caring, and direct relationship upon reentry. Now, halfway house staff believed they were in a particularly good position to act as people, first of all, because of the small size of halfway houses, and also because of the fact that halfway house staff have fairly frequent contact with residents, and definitely more frequent contact than parole officers. So halfway house workers, and again, duties differ here, are involved, for example, with residents' day-to-day activities. They hand out medications. They provide them with food money. They approve sign-out sheets when residents wish to leave the halfway house for activities in the community, such as work. So activities that appear rather mundane, short-lived, and foremost controlling and bureaucratic, but that staff believe provided them with the opportunity for greater trust and rapport, and ultimately for a more important role in residents, eventual reintegration and future. Here, and I'll come to Jessica now, interviewers made very clear distinctions between how they thought residents related to them versus how parole officers interacted with former prisoners. As Jessica said, "I like being able to work one-on-one with the clients. I don't want to be a parole officer that sits by their desk making sure that residents are following their conditions and just checking boxes and writing reports. So in other words, Jessica wants to be a therapeutic agent, not a time server or control agent. Now, the size of the halfway house and the particular forms of interaction between staff and residents, which I just talked about, in interviews assessment also meant that they were particularly well suited to supervise and to control. Specifically in their view, they had more knowledge of residents' lives and potential risk factors than parole officers, which made them, in their view, more capable of judging whether residents were actively engaged in their reintegration and committed to their release plan, or what is often called a release plan. As Michelle said, we're pretty good at determining whether someone is off because we watch them so often. So in practice, halfway house staff use various techniques of what Worth has called governing up close in order to supervise residents. That varies from room searches, counts, to checking in on residents and making them call in every time they change their location in the community. Interviews positioned themselves essentially as experts, not only in providing care and support to residents, but also in assessing their risks, including the risk of recidivating, on the grounds that they knew residents best. Now, drawing boundaries to parole officers' knowledge, expertise, and work does two things then. It helps halfway house workers justify the importance of their occupational role and create a positive sense of self. And it provides them with a narrative for why they should enjoy power over ex-prisoners' lives, and why their actions, particularly those of supervision and control, are justified within the broader context of ex-prisoner reentry. Now, both their perception of their work as supporters and supervisors are tied to halfway houses' intermediary position. So interviewers experienced the fact that they had less power and were less involved in decision-making practices regarding a resident's penal future as mostly liberating and beneficial. So specifically, and I'll come to Julie here in a second, they emphasized how their limited authority essentially allowed them to adopt a more supportive role, as they could defer the responsibility for sending residents back to prison to the parole officer. Julie said, "We're going to be more supportive because of anything legal-wise or whatever happens, it's the parole officer that's going to do it all. We don't have the ability to issue warrants, so in a way, we can be that support person, and the parole officer is looking over saying, well, the way I see it, we got to do a suspension." And then she adds, it kind of enables you to sort of empathize with the guy while still sort of enforcing the rules that this is what we have to do. Another interviewee, Doris, felt very much the same, that her inability to return a person to prison or make that decision enabled her to build rapport in what she called a healthy relationship with people coming out of prison. She said, if we had staff who were like, you're going back to jail, their rapport with the guys alone would severely decrease. Our residents' anxiety would skyrocket. I mean, it's just not a healthy relationship. She said, we leave the actual, you're going back to jail talk to the correctional staff like the parole officer, because it's not our call to make. She's ending her narrative by saying, it's not our job. Our job is supervision, supporting, documenting, and risk management. So interviews repeatedly told me and highlighted that their work was to support, monitor, and report, not to punish. And these tasks were considered non-punitive since other decisions, whether residents should be returned to prison, what the consequence should be, were seen as out of their control. So within the halfway house context, the parole officer and other state agencies are positioned as the ones with the legal authority to make decisions, such as when to punish, how to punish, and how much to punish. The halfway house worker, on the other hand, is presented as a neutral observer and just as a reporter of ex-prisoners' conduct and appearance. Now, this intermediary position or these interorganizational relationships and arrangements that we see here have implications for understanding both how frontline halfway house staff see themselves and also how ex-prisoners experience reentry. Rather than contesting their limited power or seeing limited power as something constraining, interviewers largely viewed this limited power as a benefit or indeed resource in their daily work. Their intermediary position essentially enabled them to adopt what they thought was a supportive and caring role and to rationalize the tasks of supervising and monitoring as non-punitive acts. So in other words, halfway house staff's limited power appeared to have a productive function insofar as it allowed these workers to maintain their self-image and self-presentation toward residents as caring supporters and neutral supervisors. Now, although halfway house staff have limited decision-making power, their supervision regime, of course, is meant to contribute to monitoring former prisoners and reporting to compliance, and as such, their work is clearly part and parcel of a broader supervision regime that puts ex-prisoners at continued risk of reincarceration in an inherently precarious position. And indeed, for some of the halfway house resident interviews that I talked to, the shared responsibility between halfway house workers and parole officers led to heightened feelings of uncertainty and risk. So ex-prisoners in the study were deeply aware of the fact that halfway house staff and parole officers shared information about them. And some of them expressed concern over possible misunderstandings, intentional or unintentional, during these transmissions. So one interviewee, for example, Cher, said that she preferred to connect directly with the parole officer over halfway house staff because she believed that halfway house staff might, quote, twist things around, or they don't understand it and they pass the message on differently than I meant to say. By talking directly to the parole officer, she felt like she was better able to, quote, cover all my bases because I don't want to go back. So go back to prison. So while halfway house staff perceive their own limited authority in a largely positive light, the same intermediary position may make them less likely to be perceived by residents as supportive and trustworthy agents. And that is because for halfway house residents, the threat of re-imprisonment always looms large, especially during these early months, which is typically 6 months where they reside at a halfway house. So the involvement of different agents, state and non-state or quasi-state, in resident supervision and reentry may ultimately create a more intricate web of control with increased potential for punishment. So I'll take 2 minutes to wrap up and conclude by just reflecting on 3 issues. The first one is a call to study the relational and interorganizational dynamics of prisoner reentry. So in addition to studying how specific reentry programs or organizations work in the lives of returning prisoners, work on the organizational dimensions of reentry necessitates further insight into the relational and organizational dynamics and arrangements between different reentry involved actors, both state, non-state, and quasi-state, and how particular relationships and arrangements between those actors are productive of or shape ex-prisoners' perceptions and experiences. The other issue I'm thinking about is the issue of responsibility in the context of reentry. So halfway house workers clearly accepted responsibility for certain aspects of a person's reentry, but deflected responsibility when it came to ex-prisoners' penal future. So the obvious question that may come up is, well, would it be beneficial if halfway house workers were given more extensive power to decide on residents' legal futures? Now, interviews with halfway house staff suggest that enhanced power and authority could potentially result in more individualized decisions in response to ex-prisoners' technical violations. And that is because halfway house workers indeed see and likely get to know residents better than their parole officers. And as a result, they may be more likely and able to distinguish between what Robinson and McNeil have referred to as formal compliance and substantive compliance. So staff interviews recognized that there were instances where a resident was actively involved in their reentry. They had found a job, they went to programming, everything was going well. But then, as one worker said, they slip up and have a beer, which can result in significant penal consequence, worse, the return to prison. So in other words, they believe that ex-prisoners could comply substantively, even in the event of periodic formal non-compliance. So since the data suggests that workers were more concerned overall about ensuring substantive rather than formal compliance, it is possible that granting halfway house workers more authority could have a positive impact on residents' penal futures. At the same time, as I've shown in this talk, workers feel like they're able to do more and in fact position themselves in a more beneficial light if they have less responsibility when it comes to decision making. And their lack of authority is precisely what allows them to keep a certain distance to the penal system. So the larger question I want to end with, and it's more a question than an answer, is what role should NGOs then play in the context of prisoner reentry? Given that a wide range of voluntary, non-state and state actors work in the lives of former prisoners, further examination into how reentry work should be carried out among these different actors in ways that provide ex-prisoners with the most meaningful and the most caring and helpful support while reducing the pains of supervision would be useful. Halfway houses and the larger NGOs that run them provide or occupy a peculiar position in the penal system that deserves further attention. Community-based organizations, some of who run halfway houses, in many ways see themselves as working in the community and being part of the community. They work to meet the basic needs of inner city communities to which ex-prisoners often return to. And they also act as mediators between residents and the larger welfare systems that act as gatekeepers to more substantial support, but also at times threaten to exacerbate people's vulnerability through their surveillance mechanisms and their failure to be adaptable to people's complicated lives. As such, halfway houses, I would argue, are not simply sites of transcarceral control or a byproduct of post-prison supervision, but they are part of larger community-based organizations that have increasingly been called on to fill the gaps of a shrinking and inadequate welfare system, while also being called on to supervise and to control and be part of a punitive system. What role can and should NGOs play in prisoner reentry, but also what are their limitations in providing support and playing this part in the context of people's return to prison?
Thank you, Katharina. Unfortunately,
I'm done actually, yep.
Yeah, we are way over time, so we have to get going. I'm so sorry, but thank you for that illuminating.
It was actually the last sentence, so thank you.
That was a really illuminating talk. Up next, we have David Pyrooz.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Pyrooz. I'm an associate professor at the University of Colorado Boulder. I wanted to thank Martha for chairing this panel, as well as Dr. Bucerius and the Center for Criminological Research for the invitation to present. I want to recognize my colleague and co-author Scott Decker, who with me were the investigators on the Lone Star Project, which is what I will be talking about today. So I will start by noticing or by highlighting, what you see in the background of this title slide is what's known as the Huntsville Unit. It's one of among the 100 prisons in Texas, in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. But it's perhaps the most well-known prison in Texas and has a lot of notoriety beyond that. It's the oldest prison. It was built before the Civil War in 1849. Just behind those men is where all of the executions in the state of Texas take place. It's also the largest release center that releases prisoners in the entire state. So the men that you see on this slide are among about 100 people who spill out of these doors every single weekday, rain or shine, awaiting their loved ones. In our data, we find that about 45% of them have somebody come and pick them up. Another 45%, they catch a Greyhound bus and they head over to Austin, go up to Dallas or down to Houston, or they find other ways to get home. Some of them told us they hitchhiked or they walked or so on. We interviewed 800 of these men. We asked them about their lives, about their reentry experiences, including their involvement in gangs. First, we interviewed them while they were incarcerated, and then again about 2 months and 10 months after release. And the core question that I want to share with you today, and the question that we answer in what is really early stages of this research, because we're still developing this idea, but does gang embeddedness and status change with reentry into the community? So what I'm going to do, I'm going to give you the motivation for this research. I'll share with you the materials and the methods, the findings, and then to go into a little bit of detail about the implications or limitations and the conclusions from this work. So I don't think I need to wax poetic about US incarceration statistics, especially to an audience like this. They're very well known, but it is worth me mentioning that there were around 600,000 people who leave federal and state prisons in the United States every year. And as most of us understand already, this is a significant transition, monumental for many, especially those who have served for prolonged periods behind bars. And this transition is subject to, the trials and tribulations, both small and large, of the reentry process, from exiting out of a total institution like a prison back into a community. There are issues related to finding housing arrangements, to work, reunification with family, and as Jamin and Katharina highlighted, the transition back to the community, and many groups are involved in that transition. Now, what Vischer and Travis have highlighted in their work is that this transition doesn't start the day that these men step out of prison. Reentry and reintegration, they're shaped by experiences that occur prior to incarceration and that occurs during incarceration. So Don Hummer and Aileen, they combined what's known as the importation and the deprivation models to bring together what they titled the exportation hypothesis. And so the importation model, it emphasizes the biographies and the dispositions of people who are detected, prosecuted, and sentenced to prison by our criminal justice system, and fluctuations in the tendencies to observe high rates of violence and prison culture in our system is a reflection of who we bring into our prisons. Now, the deprivation perspective emphasizes these functional adaptations to the institution that occur with the mortification of self, acclimation to the prison environment, and acculturation to the convict code. Now, what Humber and Aileen argue is that the violence that's observed and the culture of violence in prison is also exported on the way out. And so they highlight, for one, violence perpetration and victimization experiences that can be physiologically, psychologically consequential, and come to also get exported out of prison. They also highlight the normalization of cultural frames in which violence is a strategy to navigate the social world. Now, in prisons, gangs are one group that are intimately involved in violence in prison. So it's well established that prison gangs operate at or near the core of the social organization of prisons. So at least in the United States, what we understand is that gangs are active in just about every prison system across the country, whether it's state or whether it's federal. About 15% of the 1.5 million people in our state and federal prisons are affiliated with gangs, the vast majority of whom will eventually be released. So the worry is that prisoners may return to the street and bring with them the liabilities and obligations of the gang that have been accrued or exacerbated on the inside. Now, the examples abound. We could highlight dozens of them, but perhaps the quintessential example and the most tragic example was the murder of the Colorado Department of Corrections, the executive director of the Department of Corrections, who was murdered by a former prisoner who was a member of the 211 prison crew. On his doorstep, he was shot and killed. And it really drove home some of these possibilities of the risks associated with gangs. Our own data from the Lone Star Project, we've demonstrated this gang status gradient with recidivism. This paper was published a couple of months ago in the Journal of Research in Crime and Delinquency, where we find that from rearrest to reconviction to reincarceration, these rates are elevated and highest among those who are active in gangs prior to release, slightly lower for those who have dropped out, and even lower for those who have never been affiliated with gangs. So there's good reason to expect both continuity in gang involvement as well as change in gang involvement after release from prison. So from a continuity perspective, this would draw really on the exportation argument. And so a lot of times, the way gang members talk about prisons is that it's the university setting for gangs. As a gang member in Fresno that I interviewed in the county jail said, the real gang banging occurs in prison. And so adult gangs tend to be different from those adolescent gangs that we see among teenagers, and membership comes with greater expectations, including obligations to the group to further the gang's street program, as they call it. So in terms of change, though, this argument is grounded more in the reentry literature, which recognizes that the burdens of reentry tend to not only outweigh, but outlast those possible emotional and social ties that people maintain to the gang. So in this presentation, we're focusing on embeddedness in gangs. And so this is grounded in social network theory, and embeddedness captures individual immersion within enduring deviant networks. So it moves beyond this in-out dichotomy by embracing theoretically as well as methodologically these nuances in the associations with gangs. So it acknowledges identity and status, as well as behaviors, associations, and power and influence. It also acknowledges that people who may not claim an affiliation can also maintain non-zero levels of embeddedness in gangs. So the findings that I'm going to present are from the Lone Star Project. This is the Texas study of trajectories, associations, and reentry. We were awarded funding in 2014 from the National Institute of Justice. Our baseline data collection occurred in 2016, and the second and third wave of interviews occurred 2 months and 10 months after the baseline interview. We oversampled gang members by a factor of 5, and there's a breakdown based on survey and official reports of gang status. They are highly correlated, not perfectly correlated, but we're going to rely in this presentation on self-reports of someone's gang status. So in terms of our key outcome, we're relying on these gang embeddedness items that were administered to these 802 men at the baseline interview, wave 2 and wave 3. Self-identification is only available at baseline and wave 2. We had a very discouraging programming error that prevented it from wave 3 that we're still investigating right now. But in terms of our embeddedness items, so we capture status within the gang, so looking at positions where people could have no position all the way up to being a leader in the group. This captures behaviors such as participating in gang-related threats or attacks, wearing colors, flashing gang signs. We ask if this never has occurred or if this occurs on a daily basis. We ask about their associations with the gang, so the contact that they have from never all the way to daily, the proportion of friends that they have that are in gangs. And then on the influence and power side, we ask, how important is the gang to you in your life? And then how much influence do you have on the activities, the politics, and the decisions that exist within the gang? So this is a construct. We look at the items individually, but we also create a construct using item response theory, a graded response model, just given the scaling. of the items, and we report pooled period standardization across all of our results. So for the analysis, as I said, we're looking at the whole embeddedness construct combined, as well as the individual items. What we do is use the baseline as the reference period, and we compare that to the 2-month and the 10-month post-release interview. Since we have interviews nested within persons, we use multi-level modeling with random effects models. These are just pooled cross-sectional models though, but everybody gets their own start point, their own random intercept. We control for demographics, criminal justice measures, and our analytic sample is only the individuals who completed either a baseline or a follow-up interview. That's 77% of the original 802 min. So first things first, are there changes in embeddedness in gangs as people transition from prison to the street? And the answer is a resounding yes. So again, these are standardized scores. So the average is 0. The standard deviation is 1. This is what allows us to make or to compare standardized differences. We use them as the effect size, equivalent to Cohen's d. So from the baseline interview, while people were in prison, to the 2 months out, we see just about a 0.1 standard deviation drop. So it's pretty modest in that case. From wave 2 to wave 3, we see another 0.3 standard deviation drop. But if you compare from the baseline interview to the wave 3 interview, that's a pretty moderate effect size. So there are major reductions in embeddedness that are taking place. And this runs counter to the idea of the long reach of prison gangs, or this idea of continuity. It instead points to change. And if anything, theoretically, what we would expect are the all-consuming burdens of reentry are overcoming any sort of ties that people have to the gang. So what aspects of embeddedness are changing? Let's start by just focusing on status, measured as identity or positioning, and we see the results are pretty universal. Now, I should highlight on the y-axis, what you see are predicted probabilities. And again, these are adjusted for demographics and criminal justice history and so on. So with self-identification as a gang member, it drops from about 0.15 to about 0.07. So that indicates there is de-identification taking place. People are transitioning from active to former gang status. In terms of position in a gang, we measure this broadly, so affiliation or higher. So, because some people will say that, oh, I affiliate with the group, I associate with the group, I'm not a member though. So anybody who's an affiliate or an associate or higher, and you see a continued drop. It drops from 0.3 to 0.25 to 0.17. So this is the first sign of disengagement that's occurring with release from prison. And remember, this is the full sample. So non-gang members, people who claim that they were never in a gang in prison, are also included here. So next, we're focusing on behaviors, and the y-axis in this case, these are predicted values that are standardized. So looking at gang-related threats or attacks, there are reductions. There's no difference between waves 2 and 3 versus wave 2 and baseline, but you do see a difference between being interviewed at baseline, their level, their values on participating in attacks or threats, all the way up to wave 3. So there is a statistically significant reduction. In terms of wearing gang colors, flashing gang signs, wave 2, there was a jump. There was a noticeable increase that was statistically significant, anywhere from about 0.1 to 0.15 standard deviations. All right, what happens to their associations? It's a consistent pattern of disengagement, less contact with the gang, fewer friends who are involved in gangs, and those numbers are a steady decline. So it's much higher at the baseline. You see a noticeable drop to the wave 2 interview, and by the wave 3 interview, you're talking about moderate effect sizes. And then the results are a little less consistent here in terms of power and influence. How important is the gang to you? Again, there's that wave 2 pop where we see an increase that is higher than at the baseline interview and at the follow-up interview. Influence, there is a noticeable decline, a consistent reduction in influence on gang dynamics, whether it's activities, politics, or decisions. So a lot of you are probably thinking, these findings are interesting, But how much of this is driven? How much of this is driven by the non-gang members, people who have never claimed any sort of membership in a gang while in prison? And I do want to stress the point. People who have never been affiliated with gangs can still be embedded into those groups by virtue of their family, by virtue of their friends, their school, or their neighborhood. This is not to make deviant the embeddedness in these groups, but it's just to recognize the social ties, which is exactly what you would expect from a social network perspective. So here's broken out by gang status. So the people who said that they were an active gang member at the baseline interview, and then you see people who said that they had dropped out of a gang while they were in prison, and then people who had never been involved in gangs in the prison. So the action is with the current gang members, the people who were active at the baseline interview. What you see is a standard deviation, almost a complete or over a complete standard deviation reduction in their embeddedness in gangs. That's a huge reduction. That would qualify as a large effect size that we're observing here. You see a flat but negative decline, or a flat but negative trajectory for both the people who have never been involved in gangs as well as the people who are former gang members. So with my last couple of minutes, let me highlight, this will be my last slide on findings here. How do these changes look based on all these embeddedness items? Now, the first thing I should say is just to highlight the different axes, because on the y-axis, they are different. So for the never gang members, it ranges at the high from 0.2 all the way down to negative 0.8. For the former gang members, the high is 0.6. The bottom of that axis is negative 0.4. The current gang members, the top of that axis is 2 standard deviations up there, whereas the bottom of it is 0. And what you could see, there's something going on at wave 2. You see these pops that are taking place, both for the former gang members as well as the current gang members. So about 2 months out, what you see is an elevation in position, a slight jump for the former gang members in flashing or wearing colors and flashing gang signs. You see a jump in the importance of the group. And for the former gang members, a slight increase in influence, which could probably be attributed to their position. For the never gang members, what's interesting is, most of these items are pretty flat, but where you see the decline is in associations. Those associations for the never gang members are driven by prison. Their contacts with the groups tail off, their friendship with gang members tail off. But that's also taking place for the former gang members and those who are current. Those associations are absolutely changing. You're seeing large reductions, especially for the current gang members, but moderate reductions for the former gang members as well. Now, that jump in position and importance is striking. I mean, it could be that they're re-engaging in the gang for survival. It could be that they are experiencing obligations as, information and directives comes out of the prison. It could be nostalgia, that they're sort of pining for these older days of when they were more active in the group. But in the end, all these reductions are notable. All the status, behavior, associations, and power measures, they end up lower at the wave 3 interview than they were at the baseline interview. So to wrap this up, I just want to start by recognizing that, yes, these findings are specific to Texas. Texas does have a very unique history when it comes to gangs and when it comes to prisons. That being said, we could say with a good deal of confidence, at least in our data, that we're seeing the declining significance of prison gangs the further somebody is removed from prison. So prison is like this confluence for gang embeddedness in our sample across the board. And I should say about half of the guys in this study, they imported their affiliation from the street into prison. Another half, and for another half, their gang affiliations originated in the prison system. But again, we're still seeing major reductions with reentry. So they're simply not, who they were while they're incarcerated. They're remnants of their former or their imprisoned selves. And this runs contrary to this popular mythology that once you're in a gang, you could never leave. Clearly, we're seeing disengagement from gangs. Not only are there status and identity transitions that are taking place with reentry, but they're disengaging with their associations, with their behaviors, as well as the power that the gang exerts on them and the influence that they have on the gang, even with active gang members who maintained the highest levels of embeddedness. So in terms of the practical implications, we point to the issues related to this dual marginalization. For one, you have the problem of the criminal record. For two, you have the problem of the gang record that could be leveraged against them by parole agents and other members who are privy to information about gang affiliation. So whatever programmatic efforts that are initiated with such a population, for one, they need to avoid worsening conditions that could reignite ties to the gang. And they also need to respond to these informal sources or triggers that could reignite those ties. In the end, we don't ultimately aim to explain this inverse relationship between reentry and embeddedness, but it's absolutely something that we're going to be exploring in our future work by looking at in-prison characteristics, post-release characteristics, as well as individual characteristics and group characteristic. That's all for my time. Thank you everyone for attending. And here's my contact information here. All right.
Great. Thanks so much, David, for that really thought-provoking presentation. So we're going to move into some questions now for our panelists. There was many questions shared on YouTube, and I'm really excited to get into them. But before we start losing people, I'd like to just do the formal thank you to all of our presenters for being a part of the CCR's first conference. And I'd also like to acknowledge our fantastic facilitator, Jeff Broussard, and one of the graduate students helping us today, Jake Fornarovich, for just making sure everything runs smoothly and sending questions our way. Okay, so let me just pop them up over here. Okay, so I have a question for Jamie from Jamie. Jamie, first of all, really appreciates your name, and then wants to know whether drama always results in avoidance strategies, or whether you also saw it producing opportunities to help others experiencing drama, such as mutual support.
That's a terrific question. This is a book project, and I'm writing a whole chapter on generativity activities that men in this community are engaged in. So it's not a totally one-sided story where they're just staying in their homes and trying to avoid police contact. But many of them, especially those who have experienced racial stigma, are working to kind of turn that on its head by actively working in the community, particularly with youth, in those kind of helping type of activities. So in terms of drama and network avoidance being linked, I found that I did an analysis that looked at how often they happen together, and compared that for white, Black, and Latino respondents. And I found that they came together more often for men of color, but when they happened at all among white men were not likely to be expressed by the same person. So hopefully that's helpful. Great question and great name.
I sense some bias there, but thank you for answering that. Okay, so next question that I have is for Katharina. This one comes from Nicole, who first of all wants to thank you for such a great presentation and is wondering whether you're able to comment on whether there is a gendered nature to the work that you studied and whether there perhaps might be a gender divide in support versus control work.
Yeah, thanks for the question, first of all. So the majority of the halfway house workers who I interviewed identified as female. And I mean, this was a small sample, but they said this was pretty representative of halfway house work across the country. And I mean, we know that care work is gendered, and I would say that also applies to care work or support work within the reentry context, where we see a gendered dimension of this particular work, and where the work that halfway house staff were doing, which was primarily done by women who had a range of educational backgrounds and past experience working in social work, working in other reentry organizations, conducted this kind of work and drew comparisons between care and support, what they were doing with, a more masculine type of work of control and supervision, which was attributed to parole work, and also certainly correctional officer work. And I mean, that's interesting because if you break it down, much of the work that halfway house staff are doing actually quite resembles the work of parole officers and to a certain extent also correctional officers. But again, in their narratives, it was very different from some of these other criminal justice workers.
Great, thank you for highlighting the nuances that you were able to identify in your fieldwork. This question is for David, and this question comes from Michelle. So Michelle wants to know whether you have any idea why wearing colors and the importance of the gang rose significantly in wave 2. Was this perhaps an attempt to find identity or connections outside, or perhaps to show loyalty, specifically in regards to safety reasons?
Yeah, I think, Michelle, you hit the nail on the head in that regard. What I should add is, at first when I saw the results for the colors, the attire, and so on, in some ways, I think this is just a freedom of being able to choose your own clothing again. And oftentimes, we know that clothing is so closely associated with gangs. So there's that part of it. I also think some of this could be street conflicts that emerge where there's sort of a new social order that they're experiencing on the outside. But more generally, I mean, the disengagement from gang research shows that, it's a stepping stone process typically, where people will revert to their old selves, draw upon those old identities. And so I think there's a sorting out process that's taking place in which both identity is critical to that and social connections are critical. I'm not so sure if it's the loyalty or the safety though. That's something I just need to better explore in the data, but it's a great question that you're asking.
Thanks for that, David. Okay, so we are running a little bit short on time, unfortunately, and I know many of us have been wed to our computers all day, and I do believe that the team needs a full-on break. But again, I just really want to genuinely thank you all for participating today, and I'm hoping that all of our viewers on YouTube will be joining us tomorrow. So thank you again to David, Katharina, and Jamie. It's been lovely.